Istvan could never tell when the world was going to change for him. Most of the time that other world was there, but deep in the background a dull whispery rumbling like a voice talking to him was very, very far away. But then unexpectedly pain would bloom in his head and the veil would descend again, and then it was the world of Penal Colony that was almost lost in the background, and where were the worry and rush of this other place that took over, which was the real world, or were they both real, or neither? Each time that inversion took place, when things reverted to normal, that other world was just slightly less in the background, just slightly louder, just slightly more noisy. He could tell that the other prisoners were beginning to feel it too, though they didn't know that they felt it. Whatever was making the pain in his head and throwing up or tearing down the veil was simply tickling their hindbrain a little, or scratching it enough to slow rub it raw. They felt it, but didn't always know they were feeling it. They were more jumpy than they had been, and some of them seemed at times to have difficult with their heads. They became angry, said things they not only didn't mean but didn't understand. For once Istvan felt like he was into the one who was behind. He could see things that the others couldn't, and he could see its effect on them even if they couldn't. He tried to remain calm. He slept in his cell at night when the alarm went off and the doors automatically slid open. He went out with the rest of them, did his best to talk and converse and pretend like he was a person just like the rest of them. But he had never been very good at that, and soon he'd lose the thread. He knew he was different. The three who he first sat by at the table, Bill, Michael, and Waldron, seemed to tolerate him best, and he found himself drawn to them as well. Maybe because of that, or maybe just because he had sat by them first. He could see it affecting them as well, whatever it was, but differently. When the world began to recede for Istvan, it made Michael simply withdrawn into himself. Waldron became maniac, overexcited. Bill began to mumble to himself, his face slowly taking on a smile until the world came back and they all became more or less like they'd been before, though not quite. Each time they had a little farther to come back, and each time they stopped a hair or two shorter. Maybe it was partly the Penal Colony itself that made it worse. There they were, free in the manner of speaking, but with their world limited to a circle, with another circle around it, knowing that there was a third circle that they could not enter, and that from there people were watching them. Istvan had always felt watched, had felt there was just out of his line of vision someone observing him, but in the past nobody else around him had seemed to feel that way. It was reassuring in a way to know that now he was feeling something that everyone else was feeling, that as far as they were concerned he was right. Over the course of several weeks the veil became more and more prominent. for Istvan fading away into a burst of light out of which came figures from his past who spoke to him. It was though he did not know why either always the dead or people that were dead to him at first he might see the face of his brother, even the face of one of his fellow prisoners done over in white lines, and in light like an inverted self, but something about that seemed to trouble him, and whatever was sending him these visions seemed to sense this adjusted itself slightly to fit what his mind would bear. Why was it reassuring for him to see the faces of the dead rather than the living? He didn't know. He suspected that it wouldn't be reassuring, for most people might even make some of them lose their minds, but for him perhaps it simply helped him to distinguish between the world of the penal colony and this other newer world. As time went on, the light slowly faded. This new world took on color and depth, and had it not been for the pain that filled his head when it came, and the fact that he could recognize the faces as the faces of the dead, he might not have known which world he was seeing. But why, he wondered, do I see my mother? She might be dead, but he didn't know for certain whether she was or not. Maybe it was as he had thought before, that she was simply dead to him. Or maybe she really was dead, and the vision was telling him this by dressing itself up in her face and speaking in her voice. But more and more often the face that came to him, the face that slowly glowed and came out of the light and created a world around it, was the councilman. He had killed Tim Fisher. The man came to him with a broken head and a strange clomping stride. He spoke in the same voice Fisher himself had used, though how this might be possible Istvan could not say. For a long time the voice remained strange, simply repeating what Istvan himself said, but in a fashion that ran all the words together as if it were repeating something it didn't understand. "You're dead," Istvan might say. "You're dead, Fisher." Voices would echo back in the head, slowly oozing blood. "What do you want to tell me?" he asked, and the voice repeated it back. It was a little like being in a nightmare, but fascinating too. How can I understand it? He wondered. How can I make it understand me? The bursts of the power were coming more frequently, and the faces, when they appeared, seemed more and more attentive, as if they were paying close attention just to him. He found they looked closest at him when he turned numbers about in his head, built structures and patterns with them, as he'd been doing since he was a boy. What interested them about that he didn't know. Were any of the others feeling it? He didn't think so. He couldn't tell it for certain, but each of the several dozen other prisoners seemed to take in the burst in a different way, and as these bursts increased, people changed in a way that Istvan thought of as their true selves bubbling further out. They became raw, more erratic in a way that he understood, and for him, despite his visions being all the more intense, he felt like his true self was already closer to the surface. He could cope with it better than they could. One of the prisoners, a man named Brian Kahn, couldn't cope with it at all. It was after lunch. Several prisoners walked the perimeter of the inner circle. A few of them worked out on exercise machines. A few others were still sitting at the table and reading. Bill and Waldron were talking, mumbling away, their conversation getting more heated as Istvan felt the pressure in his head increasing, the burst of energy starting to come. The veil sprang up again, then the world it contained, and Istvan stayed there as silent as he could, not wanting to speak to the face belonging to Councilman Fisher in front of the others, but also not able to see or even really hear the two men sitting next to him. He stayed there with his jaw clenched, staring into the bloody face that stared mercilessly back at him, feeling at a far distance the touch of someone, either Bill or Waldron. He couldn't tell which. Seconds passed, or minutes, and then the face bleached out again and fell into the void of blankness, and the veil became tattered again, and he could see the real world again through the veil, and could hear too a second sound that sounded like screaming but was quickly cut off. Waldron was gripping his shoulder hard, not as the might have thought, because he had noticed that Istvan was having one of his visions, but rather because of what he was seeing in front of him. What the hell, Waldron said. He was staring straight ahead of him. Bill, too, had turned around and was staring, so Istvan stared as well. Kahn was there a few tables over, and for a few seconds, perhaps two, Istvan had no idea what he should be looking at, and then he saw the handle of the fork rising from Kahn's forearm, where he had plunged it in. Kahn opened his mouth and screamed again. He reached down and tugged the fork free, and blood began to pump up from the wound quicker than Istvan would have thought possible. He plunged it in again, a little farther up the arm, but just as deep, and screamed yet again. "What the fuck's wrong with you?" asked Bill, but Istvan couldn't think of a way to answer this question that would make sense to Bill. There was too much to explain, and Istvan never knew what words to use. It was as if Kahn had touched the other world, and he had brought some of it back with him, and it had lodged inside his brain, and then it had turned that part of his brain inside out and made it into something else. He didn't think it meant any harm, that it was just trying to figure out a way to speak with them, but even if it didn't mean harm, it did not understand how much it could do with a brain without breaking it. "We have to stop him," said Waldron, and started toward Kahn, but by this time the fork was out again and plunged deep into his throat, slicing open his carotid artery and puncturing his windpipe. Waldron reached Kahn as he wavered and fell off the bench. He pressed his hand to Kahn's neck as the blood spurted through his fingers, as the man sucked for air and quickly died, Waldron kept holding his hand there, staring at Kahn as if he were looking at a ghost. The others had to come and pull him away and make him stand back, but after doing that, they didn't know what else to do. They all just stood there a few yards away from the body, motionless, not knowing what to do next. Khan thought Istvan staring at the man, memorizing his face. There would be a new face that would come into him now in the other world he knew. He would now have a visit from the freshly dead. They must have been there only a few more seconds when the alarm sounded, calling them back to their cells. A few of them went back immediately, but most of them just milled about until an echoing voice issued from a loud speaker attached to one of the struts of the dome. "Return to your cells," the voice said. "You have 30 seconds. This is your only warning." With that, most of the rest began to move, though one of two remained. Bill led both Istvan and the still stunned and bloody Waldron back to their cells. Istvan sat on his bed until the cell door clanged shut, and then approached the bars, holding on to them and staring out. He caught down the hall a fluid flash of black as 4 or 5 guards in riot gear rushed from the normally closed security door that led to the next ring, through their ring and into the central circle. Then there was the sound of cries. Istvan could not see them, but imagining them setting up the prisoners who had disobeyed with their trunches. And indeed, a few moments later, 2 guards rounded the corner, dragging an unconscious and bloody prisoner between them. They let him flop down on the hallway not far from Istvan's cell. Their faces were covered with plastic shields, and the light bouncing off them, which almost Istvan thought a little astonished, made them look like they had no faces at all, or like their faces were made of light, just like the faces of the other world. One of the guards kicked the prisoner once, and then both turned and went back around the corridor and into the inner circle. A few moments later, all the guards went through again, carrying Khan's corpse out of the penal colony and into the outer ring. The door closed, and then there was nothing but silence, or almost nothing but silence. Through it, just below it, below even the beating of his own heart, Istvan could hear the whispering of voices. They're very difficult to hear, almost impossible, but he heard them. He couldn't make out what they were saying, but he tried to listen to them nonetheless.